Good morning. My name is Nicolas Morello from D4ALL. D4ALL is Canada's national transportation company. We are very happy to be here, listening carefully, trying to learn and absorb as much information as we can to improve our operations. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to Mr. Leclerc of Kéroul for the invitation to participate in this conference. Je vais présenter la prochaine conférencière, Madame Anne Frye, qui est une experte dans le domaine des transports accessibles. Madame Frye est une spécialiste internationale en matière de besoins d'aide à la mobilité des personnes âgées et des personnes ayant déficience. Elle est vice-présidente de Global Alliance on Accessible Technologies and Environments et elle précède aussi le comité de transport. Elle est également coprésidente du Bureau de recherche du sous-comité sur les activités internationales dans les transports accessibles du département des transports des États-Unis. Madame Frye dirige des projets à l'échelle européenne pour le compte de la Commission européenne dans l'optique de l'élaboration des normes d'accès pour les transports. Madame Frye a travaillé avec le International Transport Forum et avec les Nations Unies sur les effets potentiels du vieillissement global de la population sur la mobilité. Et finalement, Madame Frye est une professeure invitée au University College de Londres. Merci.
Chers amis, chers collègues, messieurs et mesdames, je suis très heureuse d'être ici à Montréal, qui est vraiment une ville exceptionnelle. Je m'excuse, je vais parler en anglais. I want now to take us some steps back, if you like. We've talked about destinations, we've talked about culture, but it's important to remember that all of us have to get there. And I guess, with the exception of those of you who live here in Montreal, we all have had to travel to get to this event. And I would be almost confident that many of us have had some anxieties along the way, some things that didn't quite go according to plan, some things that made us a little bit nervous as we went along. It's a day-to-day reality of travel. But for people with disabilities, it can be much more than that. And in terms of tourism, where we go is very often dictated not by the place we would really like to visit, but by our ability to get there. So a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And I want to take us through some of those steps that make up the accessible chain of transport. Many of us won't take the first step to make that journey, because we're afraid. We might be afraid of falling or tripping. We might be afraid of long distances. We're all aware of airports and stations where the distance to walk is really very daunting, and that's before you have to manage luggage as well. We're frightened of crowded environments, of having to move around with people around us all the time, signs we can't read, announcements we can't hear, having to rush, change of platform, change of destination. All of these things create stress. I'm showing a picture here of a very typically hugely crowded railway station in Europe. I'm sure you have them here too. And of some of the very typical information timetable boards that we see in public transport, which, unless you have a degree in timetables or you're a professional in the transport industry, you have no hope of finding out which bus it is you need to catch. And of course, many of us can't take that first step because of the way that the environment has been designed. What I'm showing here is an absolutely beautiful curb ramp, very nicely done, and right in the middle at the bottom is an equally beautiful planter with a shrub in it, which means that you can go down the ramp, but you can't get past it. Now, you have to wonder how that happened. This is in Penang in Malaysia. Somebody spent a lot of money and good design effort to create that curb drop. And equally, somebody, probably from another department within the city, thought that it would be really nice to have some greenery in the city, so they put the planter in the middle of it. Result, no accessibility. Another example, this one is a picture from an airport in Bulgaria with, again, a very beautiful ramp, but at gradient, which is absolutely impossible for most people to manage. And what you don't see just beyond the picture is actually that it leads you straight into a wall. So, good design? I don't think so. They had thought about accessibility, but as Marcus has said, what is accessibility? Putting in a ramp that is too steep and leads you nowhere is not really what we have in mind. The kind of decisions that many people with disabilities have to make when they're planning a holiday, a tourist trip, where should I go? How can you get there? Will you be able to get around when you get there? Many cities still have public transport that is not accessible, steep steps and stairs. Many of the airports you have to go through just when you start to travel have long distances, poor signing, and create a lot of confusion and stress before you've started. It's also, unless you're a frequent traveller, very difficult to know where to start. You want to fly, you're a wheelchair user. Okay, do I have to tell somebody? Who do I tell? How do I tell them? What information do they need? How do I describe my disability? It really isn't relevant whether your disability is due to multiple sclerosis or spinal cord injury. What's relevant in travel is what can you do, what can you not do? Can you manage steps? Can you cope with distances? But it's very difficult to communicate to an airline or a travel agent exactly what it is that they need to know. And of course, again, unless you're familiar with the airports you're traveling through, it's equally difficult to know whether you're going to need help. Any of us who've traveled through big international airports will almost certainly know that the distances are so great that you're going to need some kind of help. But imagine that your local airport is one of these lovely ones where you just walk a few meters and you're out at the door into departures. In those conditions, you don't need help. You're totally independent. So it's as Donald Rumsfeld might have said, it's the unknown unknowns. How do you know what to ask before you can start that journey? And then there's the question of, how am I going to get on board? Who do I contact? You arrive at the station or the airport. They've said that assistance will be available. Where do I find it? What does it look like? Who am I asking for? All of these things are questions that people face on a daily basis. You also need to know how far you're going to have to go through the airport. You're going to know how they're going to get me on board. Again, this varies hugely around the world, although many countries now have regulations, and we'll have a number of sessions on air travel, have regulations which determine the ways in which assistance is provided and require proper facilities for boarding. You'll still find in many parts of the world, as a wheelchair user, that you will be picked up and carried up the steps in a way that is both frightening and undignified. Now, maybe you're prepared to go through that experience as part of the, if you like, the price you pay to get where you want to go, but you absolutely need to know beforehand that that's what's going to happen. Equally, the question of what happens if my wheelchair is damaged. The biggest single complaint we have in Europe in air travel is lost and damaged mobility equipment. You imagine arriving for a 2-week holiday and your wheelchair is in pieces, and you're in a part of the world where the chance of getting a replacement or a repair is very remote indeed. That is a huge challenge for many people. Of course, you're supposed to have your wheelchair right up to the door of the aircraft. It is supposed to be brought to you as soon as you land at the far end. Sometimes that happens, very often it doesn't happen. There's a high risk that you've gone to Honolulu and your wheelchair's gone to Hamburg, or that your wheelchair has come out in a form that you can't manage it. So all of these things are hugely important, and the constant issue of how am I going to get to the toilet if I'm on a plane or on a train? What are the things that are going to concern me at a personal level? When you get to a city, there's also the question then of how are you going to get around? Old cities, some of the greatest tourist attractions in the world are historic cities for very good reasons. But it's very important to know what you can use and what you can't use. The slide I've put up there is from the Transport for London website, which enables you to say, I want a step-free route, I want a route with this kind of information, that kind of assistance, I want to minimize the walking distances, and that will plan the route for you. And that kind of thing is extremely helpful both to Londoners and to tourists and visitors, because it enables you maybe to take a longer route to where you want to get to, but at least to know that that journey will be manageable and that the links of the chain will come together. And of course the question of what do I do if I get stuck? Many historic cities have wonderful cobbles which are a nightmare for the small wheels on many wheelchairs. You don't want to destroy history, but you do want to be able to get around in those areas. It's an interesting fact that very often the countries with the poorest access are the ones where people are most likely to come forward and to offer to help you, albeit in a way that you may consider inappropriate and undignified. In places like Cuba, for example, people will immediately surround you and help to carry you over the many obstacles that are in and around the city. So those two are things that you have to think about, whether you are willing or comfortable with going through those kind of issues. And of course there's the question of independence. Now, many of us as tourists travel in groups, with friends, with family, but it's so important to be able to be independent when you want to be. And this quote, it would be nice if people could get around without needing others to assist them. Just a couple of examples there. Somebody on a very steep escalator at an airport, alone in a wheelchair. Those with good upper body strength will find that's no problem, but many others will find that simply an impossibility. The other picture shows an extremely steep ramp, but at least with handholds and some ability to get on board. There's the question too of tradition versus accessibility, but I think it's very important to note that it doesn't need to be a compromise. I'm showing pictures of just 4 types of transport, traditional transport. The London taxi, we have over 19,000 taxis in London, all of them are wheelchair accessible, and that's built in at the manufacturing stage. They're not adapted, they're not modified, they are built to be like that. I'm showing a tuk-tuk from India with a ramp that enables wheelchair users to get on board. A funicular railway, which is probably one of the most challenging of accessibility issues, but you don't see it in that picture, but at the boarding points, level access has been created to enable people to get on board. And again, a London red double-decker bus. All our buses in London are now low floor, wheelchair accessible, and have audible and visual announcements on board. So you can achieve accessibility without compromising on tradition. And of course, tourists go for the tradition, so to have an accessible city that has torn away everything that makes that city interesting defeats the whole object. Universal design, hugely important. I'm showing here one of my favorite examples, which is the ticket machine in the Barcelona metro in Spain, where they invited blind people to design the ticket machine. So it is now completely intuitive. They used to have to employ people to stand next to the ticket machine to explain to tourists, you put your money here, you get your change here, and it was a constant struggle and there were always queues. Now, because it's intuitive, they don't have to have people standing there anymore because everybody finds it really easy to do. The other good example of universal design is the low-floor bus. When those were first introduced in Europe, they were introduced under disability legislation. But actually, the passengers who came in huge numbers to travel were parents with young children, because for the first time, they were able to benefit from no steps, no stairs, not having to fold the buggy and carry the child. So those kind of solutions make transport and travel easier for all of us. What's in it for the operators? Well, very simple. It's good business. We've heard a little bit already. Disabled and older people, for example, are the fastest growing market for air travel in Europe. Their numbers are growing more than twice as fast as all other passengers. Many more passengers who take cruises now are over retirement age. That's the predominant market for cruise travel. Many older people, again, as we've heard already, have disposable incomes. They want to travel frequently. A lot of that's down to low-cost carriers, air carriers, because people are now making 3 or 4 trips through the winter instead of perhaps just making 1 or 2. And of course, tour companies, countries like the USA, will require that the transport at the point of destination is accessible. And that has been a very powerful driver in many countries who've seen the tourism potential from the US and elsewhere and have modified their domestic transport in order to meet that market. And of course, you know, it's important that you can get around at your destination, whether you've arrived on a cruise ship, an aeroplane, a train. You need to be able to get around, and you will generate revenue for the transport provider. So it's a win-win for everybody, but it does tend to be neglected. We've heard already about the growing market of older people with disposable income, with better health than they've had in previous years. And I particularly like this quote from Asia Travel Weekly, that the typical tourist in Asia used to be a young backpacker in need of a shower, but these days there are just as many older and retired people roaming the continent in search of its secrets. It's a changing profile, it's a changing world, but many of those people will not go to those destinations without the confidence to travel. It is, I'm pleased to say, becoming much more of a headline issue around the world. Here's just 1 or 2 headlines from recent newspapers. Transportation companies will be forced to ensure they have accessible vehicles for individuals with disabilities. A disabled-friendly public transport system is a boon for tourism. Poor accessibility for disabled deters tourists. All of these things are beginning to come to the surface around the world, and people are beginning to understand that if you don't get your public transport accessible, you don't get the tourist market. It's as simple as that. So how do we get it right? I'm showing here a couple of pictures from new trains in Oslo in Norway, both showing wheelchair access but also the use of very nicely colour-contrasted handrails and grab handles around the interior of the train. It seems to me that the key to it is joined-up planning. It needs to be the transport operators, but working also with the highway authorities. We see in so many countries beautiful new accessible transit systems like bus rapid transit that you can only access across a 6-lane highway. So you have to climb up stairs, go over a footbridge and come down again. So you are creating an accessible system that nobody can access. Marcus was speaking just now about defining accessibility. And I think in the transport industry above all, just to say you must make something accessible is actually useless unless you define what accessibility is by specifying in technical regulation the doorway must be at least this wide, the floor height must be no more than this, the manoeuvring space for a wheelchair must be so much. All of these things are crucial to delivering accessibility that works as opposed to a grand idea. It's also crucial that we involve tourism providers because they won't recommend a destination unless they know that the access is there. So we need to bring all of these parties together. We also need to bring in governments because although in many countries now there is legislation, it is not universal, it's not always enforced, it's not always working. So moving on to the things that need to be there, we absolutely need laws. I used to believe that you could change hearts and minds and it would all happen. I'm afraid that doesn't happen. It does once or twice, but not as a general rule. So you need a clear legal framework. That may start with a civil rights framework, but as I've just said, it needs to include technical regulations, technical standards, whether that be for trains or buses or aeroplanes. Absolutely vital, you need training of all customer-facing staff. I'm sure all of us have had an experience of being given bad information, bad service, bad treatment. I have many, many examples of air travellers who've been treated with a great lack of dignity, blind people asked to sit in a wheelchair to get through an airport, wheelchair users being asked to sit in uncomfortable airport chairs. All of these things come down to a lack of understanding, which in turn is based on a lack of training. So for me, training is one of the most important things. We also need to monitor. There's a tendency in many countries to say, we've passed accessibility laws, we've done that, we'll move on. But unless you monitor what's happening on the ground, you will continue to get problems. And of course, you need to enforce. You need to be in there with penalties where things go wrong. Again, otherwise standards will slip and you won't have that continuity that you need. So let's come back to the idea of the transport chain where I started. There are a lot of very clear absolute parts of that chain. There's information at the time of booking. There is travel to the airport or the station. How do you actually get there? There's the services, the facilities and services when you're there. There's the facilities and services on board, again, whether it's a train, a bus, an airplane, you need to know about that. And it's your onward travel to your final destination. Fine, those are all links in the chain, but as you will see from the picture there, that chain is not joined up, so it doesn't work. So what do we need? We need to have laws and standards, as I've said, we need to have monitoring, we need to have enforcement, hugely important. We need training, possibly for me the most important of all. We need understanding. Without empathy on the part of transport staff, you won't overcome the barriers that are there and you won't give people the confidence to travel. So let's just get it right. Thank you.